Hola, bon dia a tothom. Gràcies per haver vingut. El nostre primer ponent d'avui és Noel Kingsbury. Thank you very much, Noel, for accepting our invitation. Ell és un escriptor prolífic, assessor, professor, jardiner i conferenciant. Ha escrit uns 25 llibres, sempre sobre temes relacionats amb les plantes i els jardins. 4 d'aquests llibres els ha fet en col·laboració amb el conegut dissenyador holandès Piet Oudolf. També escriu en diferents diaris i revistes de llengua anglesa. És conegut per ser un divulgador i cronista del disseny de plantacions de caire naturalístic i ecològic. També es dedica a l'assessorament en temes de manteniment, desenvolupament de jardins i cobertes verdes, ja sigui en projectes públics o privats. La recerca és una part important de la seva manera de treballar. El tema sobre el que ha fet més recerca és sobre l'ecologia i el comportament a llarg termini de les plantes vivaces. En els últims anys s'ha involucrat molt més en temes d'educació. Està molt interessat en comunicar i en ensenyar a comunicar coneixements i habilitats a professionals i aficionats sobre temes de jardineria. Ha fet cursos online, un dels cursos que ha fet sobre plantes vivaces s'anomena Learning with Experts, aprendre amb els experts, i una altra iniciativa que està tinguent molt d'èxit s'anomena Garden Masterclass, on ofereixen tallers i conferències. A més de l'horticultura, també li interessen altres temes relacionats amb els jardins i el paisatge. De fet, temes d'un ample espectre sobre filosofia, política, economia i el medi natural en general. Podeu seguir-lo en el seu blog. Esperem que us interessi molt, crec que serà molt interessant. Vinga, gràcies.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. This morning I want to talk about ecological planting, very much in the context of maintenance. And this was the discussion I had with Mercedes when I met her in Amposta at the symposium we had back in October. So really looking at what we mean by ecological planting, but very much in the context of how we maintain it. A central issue, I think, is that we need to have a much better understanding of plants and how they function and their life cycles. And so I end up with a kind of an exploration of just one of these issues as an example of the kind of knowledge about plants that we really need to be building up for effective maintenance, particularly of ecological plantings. So I want to look at some definitions of what we mean by ecological and naturalistic planting. I think it's very important that we use words precisely. There have been a lot of misunderstandings about what we mean, and so I think it's good to really clarify what we mean by these different kinds of plantings. Planting can perform many functions, many utilitarian functions, and those will increase as we involve plants and ecosystems more in environmental amelioration, particularly in the face of climate change. Aesthetics, of course, is key to why we use plants in urban areas anyway, and that is always an interesting discussion, in the context of public acceptability, what people see as a garden, what people see as nature. And this is a subject that indeed I think came up over breakfast. This fundamentally important issue that before designing any kind of planting, we must know what the maintenance is going to be. That actually has to be the very, very first question. Those of us who are involved in creating gardens and landscapes and plantings, so often things are created that after a certain number of years are are not being maintained properly or deteriorate. We have to know what the situation with maintenance is before we commit to making a design. And I think this is something that's kind of obvious, but it is so important that we stress this. But of course, it's also good perhaps to reflect, why exactly do we maintain plantings? Well, first of all, to keep them looking good. And in terms of urban areas, we are inevitably constrained by by public acceptance, what people see as the kind of planting they want. And this can vary very much from place to place, and indeed from time to time. And certainly over my lifetime in the business, and I'm 65, so I'm getting on, and I've got, I can remember, for example, talking to people 30 years ago who would be quite astonished if they could see the kind of plantings that are now acceptable, that public opinion does change over time. And I think one of the encouraging developments over the last couple of decades is that people in urban areas have become far more accepting of what in the past would have been seen as untidy plantings, that there is a growing understanding of nature and a desire to have biodiversity in cities, and that this biodiversity may be dependent on a style of planting that some people might consider as untidy, but in the past would have probably been seen as simply unacceptable. But fundamentally, we do need to be creating things that people like and people appreciate. We may maintain for plant health and longevity, and this question of plant longevity is one that is clearly quite crucial and is part of my final case study on plant performance. Competition between plants. This is particularly key in ecological planting, where plants are growing at a higher density than in conventional planting, and where ecology is beginning to take over perhaps from horticulture. There will be more competition between plants, and this has clearly implications for maintenance. So now I want to explore these two words, which translate, I think, pretty well into many languages: naturalistic or ecological. And I think it's very important that we explore this distinction. Now, by naturalistic, what I mean is that plantings are made that in some way evoke nature, that are trying to distance themselves from sort of classical formality where everything was clipped into these fierce and inflexible geometries. It is primarily an aesthetic distinction. It's planting that is relaxed, informal, and in some ways is informed by nature. By ecological, I mean something actually quite different, and that is planting that actually has a natural dynamic. It is in some way an artificial ecosystem. We have put plants together at a higher density than conventional, and there is change over time. The planting itself has its own dynamic. So what we are doing, this is more about managing a semi-natural system than conventional garden maintenance. An example would be, for example, a meadow, a wildflower meadow, grass and herbaceous plant community that is managed in an extensive way. And so the ecological planting is one that in many ways presents a very different series of challenges. So in ecological plantings, we are looking at a plant density that is perhaps approaching that of natural plant communities. And it's an interesting exercise to think about a conventional planting. How many plants are there per square meter? And then you go out into the countryside and you look at a wildflower meadow or a wild habitat, and then think, how many plants are there per square meter? And that will be a very, very much higher figure. So this is obviously at higher density, plants are in far more competition. Ecological process, we have the life and death of individual plants and a series of natural regeneration. There is also perhaps capacity for spontaneous addition of species, which of course may be bad in terms of weeds or invasive aliens, or it may be good. Talking to Mercé yesterday, she was talking about a project of theirs with green roofs near the coast, and suddenly orchids started to appear on the green roof. That's a particularly nice example of a spontaneous addition of species. Also, the importance of biodiversity has hugely risen up the political agenda. Plantings in urban areas, or indeed anywhere, are we're increasingly asking the question, what value does this have to biodiversity, to wildlife? There has been a particular focus on pollinator populations, bees and other pollinators. But really, many of us are increasingly asking the question about, is this planting actually doing something to support biodiversity? Why do we want naturalistic or ecological planting? Well, biodiversity I just mentioned, the aesthetics which are changing, that people are wanting more nature, particularly in urban areas. There may be they may serve a function, sustainable drainage systems for pollution or noise control. And in many cases, these plantings can in fact effectively reduce maintenance. Functionality, particularly important with sustainable urban drainage systems, swales, that is to say, areas for holding on to stormwater, are becoming increasingly seen as important for managing high rainfall events. So using areas of semi-natural vegetation which can cope with occasional flooding. This is an example from the London 2012 Olympic Park, which was designed, a huge area designed very much so that all the rainfall landing on the site would be held by the site. None of it would need to flow away from the site, and therefore there was a need to build drainage swales that would hold on to storm water and then release it slowly either back into the atmosphere or into the ground. And semi-natural vegetation is very often the best way of filling the detention basins in these drainage systems. Green roofs. This is a green roof in the north of England, which has a fairly cool climate, and therefore we have a much higher level of diversity perhaps than would be possible here, but actually designed to be quite an ornamental green roof for a conference centre. Again, a semi-natural vegetation is very often the most effective at performing the functions we expect of a green roof, which again is very much to do with managing stormwater runoff. Now, beginning to explore a little bit more about this distinction, I really want to hang on to this distinction between the naturalistic and the ecological. The New York High Line, has anyone been there, seen it? A few of you. This has been this spectacular Pete Aldolf project It's 2.5 kilometre long elevated former railway in New York, which is effectively, it's a green roof. It's a substrate of about 40 to 50 centimetres deep. It has to be irrigated through the summer. It's an interesting example of exploring this distinction because for many of the people, many of the city dwellers there, this is nature. Whereas for a naturalist going along there is no way they would see immediately that this is not a natural plant community, although it has many locally native species. So it plays very much with creating something that is like a stylized version of nature. And it almost certainly supports quite a lot of biodiversity. And there are some, I think, ongoing studies about insect populations that's showing you just what the benefits it has. But it is also very important to realize that this is not necessarily an ecological planting. It's very heavily maintained to keep the balance between the different plant species. And that if maintenance was suddenly to stop or be greatly reduced, its character would no doubt change very quickly. With peat Aldorf planting generally, it's important to emphasize that this is basically art. It's not ecology. Pete is not an ecological planting designer. What he is inspired by nature, which is something completely different. And his plantings may, in many ways, evoke nature, but they have no ecological functioning. They are designed to be very stable over a long period of time, to be, and they're perhaps best thought of as large-scale works of art. A byproduct of which is that there is very often biodiversity benefits. These are undoubtedly very good gardens for pollinators. There's food resources for birds and insects over the winter. But they are very much in that naturalistic category and not the ecological. The other extreme, we have these plantings which are native only, which of course are dependent entirely on the aesthetics of the local flora, which if the local flora is quite limited, severely limit the design possibilities. This is the garden behind the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. As you'll agree, it's, not very exciting. I mean, arguably, we shouldn't have anything too horticultural with this backdrop of a fairly wild landscape. But it's not really what most people would recognize as a garden or planting. What interests a lot of us is what comes in the middle. This is the Barbican, a 1980s housing area in central London, where Nigel Dunnett from the University of Sheffield did planting, I think we're looking at about 8 years ago, over quite an extensive area. And again, this is effectively a green roof. It's a 45 centimetre deep substrate. So-called step planting, very much modelled on the steppe community, plant community of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, so designed to be very drought tolerant. This is probably at its most spectacular period in May with Euphorbia caraceus in flower and various alliums. And this is a planting that is very definitely ecological. There is a very clear ecological dynamic here. This planting has a life of its own, and things are happening which are not necessarily planned, but which have to be. So maintenance of this is very much about managing a living organism than controlling something that is fixed and static. So looking at ecological design and maintenance in practice, We implement a planting. There is an establishment phase where everything grows, and conventionally we have this end result, which is what the designer thought of in their head when they were designing the planting. It is a one-track, single process towards an intended result. And of course we are dependent on this person, the gardener, to maintain it during its establishment phase, and then once it has finished, once it has got to the point of it's in the designer's mind, to keep it that way. So everything is always brought back to maintaining that particular appearance, which is effectively what you are having with a Piet Oudolf planting. However, in an ecological planting where there is more interaction between plants, where we are actually creating a system rather than simply an end result, there are potentially different options for development. There are various different outcomes. Particularly during that establishment phase, the management of certain plants may result in quite different outcomes. And in some cases, certain outcomes may be precluded. They may not be possible. For example, if a species is particularly vigorous in those early years, it can swamp and smother other less vigorous plant species, which may then be lost from the planting. And so that particular an end result that involved those species would not be possible. So what we're looking at is actually a much more dynamic process, which does raise the question, and I think this is an extremely important point to consider for the future. Are maintenance staff, are they horticulturalists or ecologists? I would argue very much that the creation of more extensive naturalistic, really genuinely ecological plantings does require almost a new profession, because what we're looking at is seeding and vegetative spread, the death of short-lived species, the arrival of spontaneous species. We're looking at a complex system, an ecology, which needs a different set of knowledge and skills to conventional horticulture, but which are very much an obvious extension of those skills. And in fact, one bit of good news here was that Nigel Dunnett emailed me yesterday. Oh, it's a rare event getting an email from Nigel. He's a very busy man and not very good at answering emails. I was very glad to get this nice long email, one paragraph of which was saying about Sheffield, they are trying to set up a training centre for people in the landscape management business to train young people to do exactly this, to manage these more dynamic systems. Because in reality, looking at plants, I'm focusing more on perennials here, that over time there's a whole range of different plant trajectories, which is why I come back to this point that we need so much more to understand plant life cycles, plant lifespans, and plant performance over time. We can have some species that are relatively stable, others that are set to continually expand, others that expand but then break up to form separate clumps that go their separate ways, or we might have short-lived species that in nature continually regenerate themselves by seed, but of course the conditions for that regeneration have to be there. So looking perhaps at this as a spectrum, once we move from simply an aesthetically defined naturalistic planting across to something genuinely ecological, plant density increases, and with it, competition increases. But a lot of what we're interested in is occupying this middle position. It's creating plantings that look pretty fantastic over a long season, but have a certain level of ecological functioning. So the more ecological process we have towards the left here, we have a greater plant density and potentially a greater value for biodiversity. And for those of you who are interested in this biodiversity agenda, this is a really important point, that the density you have with semi-natural systems offers far more habitat and food, etc., for biodiversity. Conventional plantings where you have relatively low plant density simply cannot offer anything like the level of habitat and resources for wildlife. How much maintenance they take is a very interesting question. Conventional planting, I'm referring to as intensive maintenance, where plants are maintained individually. They tend to require quite a lot of relatively low-skilled work, whereas more ecological plantings actually, which I'm calling extensive maintenance, for example, a meadow where you're not looking after individual plants, you're treating the whole thing as one, that's extensive maintenance. It doesn't take much time, but it does need a lot more skill. Decisions, for example, when to mow, when to intervene, which seedlings are weed seedlings to get rid of, which are seedlings of plants in the mix that we want to keep and encourage. There's a level of knowledge needed which is different to and much greater than you would find in those who maintain conventional maintenance. And so the time required to maintain may be a lot less, but there's a really very different skill and knowledge area, which is why I think it's so important that we move towards a profession where there's a much greater knowledge and appreciation of plant ecology. And finally, at the bottom, just flagging up that there is this, all over the world, is huge interest in using locally native, regionally native plants in planting design. And that as we move from the naturalistic to the ecological, overwhelmingly the ecological planting is about using locally native species. And that's for very understandable reasons. For a start, the desire to avoid using anything that is potentially an invasive alien. Although I would flag up that what are called novel ecosystems are increasingly being recognized as ecologists as genuine ecosystems, and that over time we probably will end up using more non-native species in these plantings. So this then is this crunch point for the future. We need a profession that is far more ecologically informed. So looking at some examples, this is an example of so-called mixed planting in Germany, where there's been a huge amount of research over quite a long period into developing planting systems primarily for public areas. Very often with spectacular results. This, in fact, it's a factory complex in the Rhine Valley where the designer, Bettina Jaugstetter, has created a randomized planting mix of about 15 or so species, and this is next to the catering facility for the factory. It is an example of something that is, in fact, I would say, it looks pretty wild, but it's very much naturalistic rather than ecological. It has to be very tidy, it has to be very controlled. It's all the dead material is taken away in the winter. It's something that's very highly managed, but nevertheless conveys that sort of loose feeling of nature. An example of a planting I did some years ago for Bristol City Council. This is an example of really a very difficult situation where I knew from the start that the maintenance would be absolutely awful and really minimal, and in a city, in a part of the country with an extremely wet climate, a very long growing season, very, very weed-friendly climate. So a really limited range of plants that I knew that would be able to fill space quickly and more or less coexist with really minimal maintenance. So something more ecological, because part of the thinking here was that these species will be spreading, they will be competing, they will. The important thing was that we had as much space filled for as long a period as possible to minimize the risks of weed incursion. And indeed, for about 10 years or so, these were very successful. Although unfortunately, it's a long time since I've done any work for the city. And for these plantings, one of the important things was the ability to self-repair. On a traffic island, every now and again, someone drives over it, plants get damaged. So having things, herbaceous plants that can spread and fill gaps was very important. One of the particular uses of genuinely ecological planting has been in post-industrial sites. Areas of central Germany and northern England in particular have very extensive areas of cities that were part of old industrial areas, which with very poor quality, often polluted soil, an enormous amounts of rubble from old factory buildings, and so a substrate that is very free draining, very low in fertility. No one would want to garden this, but of course it is an ideal habitat for that very wide range of species we have in Europe that will flourish on thin calcareous soils. So this is in Sheffield. It's one of the plantings created by Nigel Dunnett. University of Sheffield Landscape Department has been very much leading in this field for many years. And the two professors, Nigel Dunnett and James Hitchmore, are very pragmatic. They don't have any particular, they don't see any particular need to use only native species. So this particular seed mix that was used for this post-industrial site does include quite a lot of southern European species as well as British native ones. So you notice, anyone with plant knowledge, I think, looking at this can knows immediately that this is a very poor substrate. Plants are low growing, the vegetation is very sparse, there's not much nutrient to go around, but of course this sparseness does mean that it's very possible to have a very high level of plant diversity and capacities for shorter-lived species to continually self-seed over many years. And so we can have a really high diversity planting, very easily created, relatively easy to maintain over pretty extensive areas. And so a post-industrial site with terrible soil in some ways can be a really good thing. And a closer up there, giving you an idea of the range of plants that are flourishing at relatively high density. And again, another example in Germany, city of Magdeburg. A huge amount of post-industrial dereliction, a lot of which has been tidied up, and with these very poor soils sown or planted with planting mixtures that, because growth is so slow, we don't have a great deal of organic matter produced. They are relatively stable and need really very little maintenance. Other situations we are faced with a need for maintenance around plant longevity. And researching plant longevity has been a particular interest of mine. When you plant something for a client, you want to know, how long is, or you should be asking, or the client should be asking, how long is this going to survive? And very often, we don't actually know. We have this distinction between annuals, biennials, and perennials, but how perennial is perennial? And we talk about lavandula as being short-lived. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? I think one of our documentation and research tasks should be, we need to be doing a lot more about gathering information on plant longevity. This was a site I worked on a few years ago, a particularly difficult place. It's on the coast. It gets very strong winds. It gets a lot of salt. All the local residents, a lot of local residents, waste of money planting. It'll all die. It'll all be swept into the sea in the first winter. And it has actually survived remarkably well. And we used a very extensive range of plants, a lot of them Mediterranean subshrubs. But of course, there is the issue here that a lot of these are naturally relatively short-lived plants. And so the inevitable question is now, 10 years later, quite a lot of things are dying. What are we doing about replacing them? And this is has to be realised right in the beginning, and ideally there has to be some sort of schedule for at some point going in to replace plants. And fundamentally, what I was trying to do here was to create a plant mix based around evergreen subshrubs that would create these microhabitats for perennials and grasses to thrive amongst them. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, I had an email from somebody who lived locally who just wanted to contact me to say how much he enjoyed this planting. And I thought, this is great. This is 10 years later. Anyway, he sent me some photographs, and very interesting to see what has happened over time. Certainly one of the problems has been that inevitably with certain species like Santolina, lavandula, we are needing to replace. Now, back again to the Barbican, which I think is a wonderful example. If you ever go to London, check out the Barbican. It's a really interesting place to see because it's relatively isolated, so you don't get a great deal of weed seed blowing in. So that's one problem that's kind of out of the way. It doesn't have any irrigation, so in a hot summer, things can get pretty dry. So it's really very interesting to see what's happening over time. And for one thing, the plant density, you immediately appreciate it, is really high. It's much higher than in a conventional planting. There's much more complex intermingling of plants. As you can appreciate here, we're getting that real density that's almost building up towards what we would see in a natural situation. And with these grasses, it has a good long season of interest. And I think what is really interesting, it's always really interesting to get down on hands and knees. It's what I call the rabbit's eye view. It's that seeing what is going on at ground level, where shoots meet roots. That's very often where you can really understand what's happening with plants. And I was fascinated at the Barbican to see just how much self-seeding was going on. We've got the Armeria seedlings popping up here. We've got sedum, now Helioteliphium seedlings there. We've got Oenothera there. Now, Oenothera, of course, is a biennial or short-lived perennial that has to continually self-seed if it is to be part of a mixture. So it's pretty good that's self-seeding. And I think there, that is a Euphorbia caraceus seedling. Again, relatively short-lived plant. It has to self-seed if it is to be part of a mixture. So a great deal of natural regeneration. And in fact, if you want to know what the number one maintenance task is, the fact that it is a couple of the grasses are seeding really rather more and would eventually probably suppress quite a lot else. So that seems to be one of the main maintenance tasks, is actually thinning out some of the grasses. Moving on to aesthetics, I just wanted to make this point that there is a real need for creating visual structure, that a lot of these naturalistic or ecological plantings are quite soft, they're quite fluffy, they have this kind of loose texture, which means they lack a kind of visual definition. And it's one thing people like. People like a bit of structure. And that can be very often achieved really very simply and very decisively. And of course, in the Mediterranean, we have these wonderful Cypressus sempervirens, which is the most wonderful tree for just instantly conveying, this is a garden, this is a designed space. The rest of it may look pretty wild, but cypresses show, this is a garden. This is Olivier Philippe's display garden. Olivier Philippe, I'm sure you know, the French nurseryman who has done so much to promote this style of planting with Mediterranean plants and really confront the issue of minimal maintenance. And his space, which is very much dominated by these kind of low, hummocky sub-shrubs, is really transformed by having the cypresses. But you can do the same thing with clipped foliage. That great traditional way of clipping foliage can have a real use in these planting styles. They don't take up much space, but they convey to the public that this is intentional, that we have these, this is a taxus here in a garden designed by Tom Stuart Smith in the English Midlands, very much a naturalistic perennial garden, but with these very clear geometries created by these clipped taxus. So that is very much conveying the message that the wildness here is in fact intentional. And of course there is that wonderful creative tension between the stiff, defined nature of the clipped trees and the soft textured planting. Plantings like this is by Alejandro O'Neill in the south of France. Tend to explore a kind of a wilder look. In fact, there's quite a lot of very active maintenance going on here. Alejandro has developed a whole schedule of pruning, which is very much about maintaining this quite wild look. And certainly, I think he should certainly be somebody you should be listening to, because he has a wonderful knowledge of regional plants. Now, I'm going to end up with an example of the kind of research we need to be doing to understand better how plants function and perform over time. Because with that knowledge, hugely useful for any kind of planting design, but particularly in ecological planting, where plants are facing a lot of competition, and we have a natural dynamic and things are continually changing over time. It's absolutely imperative that we improve our understanding and appreciation of plant growth over time. And in the past, I've spent a lot of time digging plants up and getting terribly muddy, washing soil off roots and photographing root systems, which can be a very useful exercise. Here we've got Geranium endressii, which I think is a native of northern Spain and the Pyrenees, with its wonderful rhizome systems, and the fact that we have these long-lived rhizomes is it helps to explain very clearly that here is something that will be a very effective ground cover, a very effective weed suppressant. But I want to focus on shrubs in Mediterranean climates, and this because this is obviously a particularly important issue for us to understand, particularly in the light of the fact that people like Olivier Philippi and some of the local nurseries are now making available a far wider range, a far wider genetic diversity of shrubby species. It's imperative that we really understand their growth patterns over time. It's very important that we understand that the typical shrub that we use in horticulture is something that has this continual basal regeneration, that you have a structure under the ground, therefore out of sight. This is the problem with anything that happens underground. We don't really know what's going on unless we do a lot of digging. That is continually producing new stems. And so if we get down on hands and knees, get the rabbit's eye view, we can see that we have these new shoots emerging. This is in Kew Gardens, and so there's a very helpful little label there saying that this was planted in 1936, so clearly a very long-lived shrub, but illustrating very nicely, I think, how we've got these older stems of varying ages and then new ones just emerging. And so we have a cycle of growth of new stems and the deterioration and eventual death of the older ones. So the whole thing is a cyclical process. And you can see this in many shrubs. Viburnum tenus, for example, if you cut that away, you can see that there's new stuff coming from below and there's new shoots emerging from lower down on branches. Laurus nobilis, another example. Then there are some shrubs that are essentially rhizomatous. They have underground structures which enable the plant over time to spread, to continually send up new shoots, which in many situations can be extremely useful. I mean, Nandina is a wonderful thing for creating a screen or hedge because of this ability over time to spread. Which is a relatively unusual one amongst horticultural shrubs, but in some circumstances an extremely useful one. Pistachia lentiscus, an incredibly tough, locally native plant that can be extremely useful, and the fact that it's not been used horticulturally historically is, I think, perhaps quite surprising. And this, of course, can be hard pruned. You can cut it right back, and it will regenerate, which obviously gives you enormous flexibility in how it can be used. Certain other, for example, salvia species that are not native to the region but which are increasingly being used, again, these have patterns of basal regeneration, and which means you can cut them right back and you get full regeneration. The extreme example of this are those species that have a lignituber, which is particularly well adapted to continual grazing or the impacts of fire. Quercus coccifera is a great example of something that has a substantial underground structure that is able to continually regenerate. And arbutus, after the terrible fires in Portugal in October 2017, the year afterwards, one of the extraordinary things to see was this incredible strength of regeneration of arbutus. Plants that had been burnt to the ground the year before were, a good metre and a half above ground a year later. So obviously a very, very valuable thing for that regeneration. But so many Mediterranean species, shrub species, woody species, are plants of successional environments. They have a genetically imposed limited lifespan. there's no basal regeneration. All the growth is on the outer part of the plant. Here at Philippi, we see this typical shape of many of these Mediterranean subshrubs. And Philippi, being Philippi, is indeed documenting lifespans and their ability to regenerate. Stare into the heart of many of these subshrubs. This is, in fact, a New Zealand hebe, and you will see almost no sign of regeneration. We haven't got all those new shoots coming up you have with a true shrub. You've simply got these stems and all the growth is on the outside. These are plants that, for the most part, you can't hard prune. You hard prune them, you kill them. Which means over time we end up with these very unattractive sites here. This rosmarinus, which of course now is called Salve rosmarinus. So all the growth is at the top, just dead stems. Try to cut that back. Goodbye. The Mediterranean region, in fact, the dry summer climate regions generally have a high proportion of species that behave like this. All these Fabaceae, for example, that this wonderful range diversity of Fabaceae we have here in the Iberian Peninsula, these are generally follow this pattern. Weak root systems, which means once they fall over too easily. Or here, this is an Australian example that's used in horticulture quite a lot. It's continual growth, but a cross-section reveals we've got no regeneration, and so that eventually, at some point, these will have to be replaced. They can't be renewed, they have to be replaced. So longevity then, it's always best to understand anything in nature in terms of a gradient, a spectrum. Looking at longevity, we've got at one end those species that have this genetic trait to be short-lived, and there's nothing we can do about that. We can perhaps manage them to extend the life cycle, but at some point they are going to have to be replaced, or we accept them as sacrificial, and that something else more long-lived will take over. And at the other end, we have these species with lignotubers, which have an amazing ability to regenerate, and then everything else being somewhere on that spectrum in the middle. And this, I would make a parallel with herbaceous perennials, which again, we have this spectrum between species that are genetically programmed to seed and die across to those that are, in fact, very strongly spreading. So again, we have this spectrum. And our future in terms of really managing more complex ecological plantings does depend very much on building up knowledge and expertise in these kind of issues, which is why I flagged this up as an example. So, thank you very much. I would just flag up, and I think Messe mentioned that a business I've had with a colleague in England for the last few years. During COVID, we went digital. We've produced an enormous amount of online material with gardenmasterclass.com. And we are making a particular point of doing programming, webinars for people working in dry summer climate zones. And we are, well, at least I have a colleague in Madrid, Ignacio, who is trying to start a Castilian language version, Academia del Paisaje. It's not up there yet, but it will be up there soon, and that will be, again, a place for webinars, webinar recordings, masses of online material about planting and garden design, and we are hoping to get Spanish subtitled versions of some of our English language productions. And we're also increasing a collaboration with Pacific Horticulture in California, where there's a huge amount of knowledge built up over, again, working in dry summer climate zones. So, we like to we like to learn and we like to spread that knowledge. So check us out. Thank you.
No hi ha cap pregunta, eh? No? It's possible to ask some questions? Yeah. Però, un moment, perquè si no la traductora no et podrà... On estàs? Perdoneu.
Bon dia, felicitats. Si em permeteu només una reflexió, no sé si me escuchas con la traducción. Sí. Perfecte. Nada, simplement, deixa'm agrair que facis èmfasi en el coneixement, diguéssim, fisiològic de la planta, perquè crec que és una de les qüestions que a mi m'agradaria insistir, sempre insisteixo, la importància del coneixement de la fisiologia del vegetal. Abans parlava la representant de l'administració del tema de les restriccions d'aigua i de més. Nosaltres aquí en el nostre clima, que és diferent del que normalment tu treballes, estem anant cap a una situació molt extrema en quant al tema de la pluviometria i el tema de l'aigua. Per tant, jo simplement fer una llança al coneixement de la fisiologia per saber com hem de regar les plantes i quin profit podem treure de la pròpia biologia de les plantes. O sigui, si coneixem això, serem molt més capaços de, amb regs, diguéssim, acurats, poder tenir igualment una vegetació adaptada al medi. Només això. Gràcies.
Can you hear? Yeah, this is very, very important. And this is where I would emphasize that we need to have academia who do this research, passing results on as quickly as possible to practitioners. A wonderful example of this is in Sweden, where there is, for various historical reasons, a very long tradition of essentially government-promoted specification of trees, but research being done there on including drought stress on trees is being wonderfully promoted by Professor Henrik Schumann. We've commissioned, for example, to do some webinars for landscape architects. It's really quite a lot goes on in the academic world, but it's so important that academics communicate, but also that we dig around and look at research and try to make use of it as well. But also building up personal experience. That is also something hugely useful. That the knowledge you build up over time. It would be wonderful if experienced practitioners, we had some system of being able to access their knowledge and encouraging them to pass that on to younger or newer members of the profession.
No hi ha més preguntes?
No, okay.
Bé, doncs agrair-li. No? Doncs agrair-li molt.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.